and welcome to the United Nations Pathways video conference series here at Fairleigh Dickinson University. I am Elise Salem, the Associate Provost for Global Learning, and we are delighted to be hosting this event in collaboration with the Ambassadors Club at the UN. I would like to welcome Ambassador Kamel and our guest for this morning's discussion, Mr. Mbaidjol, Director, Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. The issue of human rights is very important to us here at Fairleigh Dickinson. Last year we held a very large symposium on human rights and conflict resolution that drew over 1,000 students and has generated much post-symposium activity. As a matter of fact, next month on this campus we will hold another symposium on human rights and civil liberties on this campus on April 23. So we are very much looking forward to learn more this morning on human rights and the issue of refugees. This event will be taped and available for our participating universities and other interested groups on our Global Issues Gateway website, gig.org. After your presentation this morning, there will be a Q&A session with both our Fairleigh Dickinson campuses, beginning on the other campus, Madison, and then switching here to Teaneck with 2 questions from each group alternating. Dr. Joanne Murphy, our new United Nations Program Coordinator, will then conclude the event from Madison. So I thank you very much, and we look forward to your conversation.
Thank you very much. We are delighted here at the United Nations to be back in contact with Fairleigh Dickinson and with the other universities backing you up as the central hub. And I'm even more delighted to have as our distinguished panelist today, Mr. Mbaidjol, who is more than just the head of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in New York. Mr. Mbaidjol comes from Chad. And Chad, as you know, is a country which is facing tremendous difficulties in refugees, most of the refugees coming, as we know, from the conflict in Darfur. And the conflict in Darfur, as you know, is essentially a problem of human rights violations. He also has been on mission and has just returned from Kenya, which is another country in which there has been difficulty in adjustment of human rights between different tribes and the facilities that they all have in land use. And that conflict or potential conflict in Kenya has been prevented literally by a last-minute agreement on power sharing. And so hopefully the conflict will not reoccur or degenerate, and there'll be no refugee problem in Kenya either. So thank you very much, sir, for joining us today.
Thank you.
With his permission and with yours, I would like to lead into the subject myself. There is an intimate link between human rights and refugees. These are not 2 separate subjects, even though we have 2 high commissions in the United Nations, one for human rights and one for refugees. The linkage is that if you look at refugee situations in the world, most of them arise from conflicts. And if you analyze the conflicts, most of them arise from human rights violations in some form. And so we have to analyze human rights and human rights violations if we want to prevent the type of suffering through which refugees have to go through. Refugees, as you know, are people who have to give up their home, their hearth, for reasons beyond their control, whether they are economic or political. And therefore, it's not easy for somebody to give up his home. And therefore, it's a major violation of the right of human beings to settle in a fixed place and to enjoy life with decency and in with welfare. Now, the current wisdom in the United Nations, of which Mr. Mbaidjol is the incarnation, is that human rights were discovered in 1948, because that is when the Universal Declaration was passed. And needless to say, this is totally wrong. The concept of human rights goes back thousands of years and is the fundamental of all the spiritual underpinnings of human society, and definitely of all the religions of human beings, because all of them deal with the concept of man's relationship with fellow man and the need for respect and tolerance. But in Western civilization, which started a bit later than the others, certainly much later than the African or the Asian civilizations, Western civilization started out by an extraordinary concept, which was what was called the divine right of kings to do no wrong. The king was always right. Why he was always right, we do not know. But it was because he was a descendant of God. And that concept was taken to task in the first milestone in human rights, which is 1215, which is Magna Carta, in which a certain bunch of noblemen got hold of the king and said, Mr. King, this will not do. You cannot in future take decisions without consulting us. Now, this is not democracy. It's only the noblemen putting shackles on the divine right of kings to do no wrong. Then we had a second milestone 400 years later. This is now 1675. Critically important milestone, because 1675 is the act of habeas corpus, an act in which for the first time it was laid down that even the king could not just pick you up and put you in a dungeon, but had to produce you in front of a third party, namely a court, to explain why you were being put in a dungeon. Now, this is what in modern times is called no arrest, no detention without charge. It's a 400-year-old law. It's a law which is a fundamental part of all legal systems in the world. And unfortunately, from time to time, it is thrown out of the window in places like Guantanamo. The third milestone comes in the way of these two glorious revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, both of which are based on the concept of human rights, and both of which talk about the right of the individual to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But having discovered this both in the United States and France, both the US and France was found to be lacking in the implementation of the truth that they had discovered. Slavery for 100 years after discovering life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and then another 100 years for segregation, if not slavery. France found the Declaration on the Rights of Man and then spent 200 years in the colonization of Africa and totally denying the human rights of the Africans whom they had colonized. And so the discovery of the principles did not automatically result in the implementation of the principles. And that is perhaps why Mr. Mbaidjol is so keen about 1948, because in 1948, thanks to an extraordinary American lady, Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, everybody was pushed, cajoled, urged to come together, and we signed an extraordinary document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, supplemented about 10 years, but actually less, 8 years later, by two conventions, one on political and civil rights, and the other on economic and social rights. So we have a certain background. Now, the question that I would like to pose to Mr. Mbaidjol is, now that you've spent 1,000 years discovering human rights, how is it that we still have, even after 1,000 years of effort, certain very serious problems with human rights? The first of these problems is that we give importance to political human rights, but do not give importance to economic human rights. After all, the right to food, the right to development, the right to life in decency, these are fundamental human rights and cannot be made secondary to the right to free speech or the right to free assembly or the right to free religion. If you are dead from starvation, you care two hoots about whether you have the right to speech or not. And how is it